Welcome back to Studio Life, everybody. Today we're going to be having a quick little chat about fees, what to charge, what is this whole thing now, mixing, mastering, what's it worth? Because things have changed. Anyway, let's find out. Is it? I'm a big fan of the Working Audio Tools podcast, which is done by Ed and Paul. I really like it. They talk about some really interesting stuff. And they had a discussion recently about what to charge and, fees and all that kind of stuff, how best to put yourself across, on your website. Do you have a fixed fee? Do you have a sliding scale depending on what you're doing? How many stems, how many tracks, all that kind of stuff. How do you go about pricing in the music business in this day and age? And it got me thinking, because things have changed significantly and it really affects people at our end of the industry. So way back when I started, there was a physical product that we were all involved in making. And the way things happened on a major label kind of level was that a label would have an act, an artist, band, whatever, and they would need products to sell. And in those days, the album, the product, was the thing that brought in the majority of the income that artist would earn. These days, touring does that. So back then, you would tour, sometimes at a loss, in order to sell albums, because that was the thing. Singles promoted albums, tours promoted albums, albums were the thing, all the focus was on the album. Therefore, record companies would put up big advances and big budgets in order to make the album that they thought would sell the most. There's a whole nother subject there about, what they were doing, how they were doing it, was it right, and all the rest of it. But that was how it worked. So there would be some significant budgets to work with. So the record label and the band between them would decide who was going to produce, probably. Sometimes the band wouldn't ever say, sometimes they would. You'd hire a producer. Producer would then decide what studio he would like to work at. Maybe the band would be involved in that decision, maybe not. Depends on the band and the relationship with the label and the producer and everything else. So there'd be a producer hired. They would hire a studio or a bunch of studios. They would either then use the house engineers or they would hire specific engineers. This is just recording still at this stage. And then you might need an arranger. You might need a programmer, because in those days, people didn't know how to program synths and drum machines necessarily. So you would have a programmer. There would be a whole bunch of people, producer, engineer, assistant engineer, tape op, programmer, arranger, all in the studio, all getting paid a daily rate. Producer is the only one then, and still now, who is on a cut, who is on a percentage point. That still irks me a bit. Mixed engineers, I think, should be in there. I think they're integral to the sound of a record, obviously. So anyway, that's another debate. So making a record was expensive. All these people were charging daily rates, and studio was charging a daily rate. And don't think they were cheaper back then, because it was a long time ago. The studio I worked at in 1990 was £1,200 a day in 1990. That was a lot of money then. It's a lot of money now, but it was even more then. So it was an expensive business. Record labels put a lot of money into making albums, which meant that if you were a mix engineer, freelance, let's say, back in those days, you could charge a lot of money for a mix. And the whole industry started shifting, and there were these like producer teams that used to spring up. And obviously we had people like the Neptunes, we had Timbaland, and obviously we had people like Dr. Dre working in like the whole hip hop thing in the States. They started charging for a beat, which everyone knows what that is now. Back then it was a little bit more. What do they mean by that? And it's like a backing track. I have made a track, you then rap or sing over it, whatever you do. And rather than getting involved in, you got to pay me this much per hour, this much per day, it was a set fee. I think Dre was charging $250,000. I think the Neptunes charged 180,000. I think Pharrell was somewhere in between. Huge amounts of money. But artists and labels, whoever was paying the bills back then, it was worth it. If you get a production of that level, of that cachet, it would sell. That would be the single, and then the album would sell, and you'd get all this huge amount of money coming back in, because if you sold 100,000 albums back then, you made $1 million. And sometimes you sold 1 million albums, or multiple millions of albums. Bearing in mind, some of the big acts of 30 years ago or whatever, like the U2s or whatever, they would sell 5, 6, 7 million albums. That's a lot of money when you're selling a product. Somehow we've all been manipulated into this world where now people pay a tenner a month and they can have everything. It just streams on Spotify, and Spotify pays very, very little. I think it's something along the lines of, I think 1 million streams gets you $4,000. That's why there is a real disconnect between what you're charging and what the artist or customer, producer, label or whatever wants to pay. Because the money coming back in is, unless you're in that top 2%, it's not there. So it's very, very difficult to justify spending huge amounts of money. So I doubt if there's anybody now charging $250,000 for a beat. I doubt if there's any mix engineers charging anywhere near that kind of money. Like, seriously, the levels have come down, way down, because the money isn't there at the other end of the industry. It's not coming in. You're not one of the expenses they can write off against tours because you're nothing to do with a tour. Yeah, it's tricky. So what should you be charging for a mix? Is 500 quid reasonable? Is £1,000 reasonable? Let's take £1,000 as a fee for mixing a song. Let's say there's 12 songs on the album. That's £12,000 for the mixing. And then you've got the mastering on top of that. Let's say an average mastering cost these days, probably in a pro mastering studio, you're probably looking average around £100 a track. Maybe more, maybe less. Just depends where you're going and who's doing it. By the time you've added in paying a producer, paying an engineer who's going to record it, there's a whole, you're easily 15 to 20, easily, before you've even paid any musicians. Which might work if you're working with an artist and you're just an artist and a producer, there is no musicians. If it's that kind of thing, yeah, that might work. But it's a lot of money still. Bearing in mind that there's not a physical product. I'm lucky I work with artists that still sell physical product. So that helps. Excuse me. However, the majority of people still stream. And that money isn't coming in to pay for the costs of making a record. So yeah, we are all trying to find a level. We are all trying to find an amount of money that makes sense to keep the industry going. Because what's happening at the moment, the way I see it, is that it's kind of, these two lines are converging. The lack of income and the increased amount we need to charge in order to earn a living because of the cost of living and, rent, rates, whatever it is you're paying. They're going to hit each other, those two lines, and they're going to cause a problem. And what we don't want is bottom feeders. What we don't want is crashing to the bottom in order to try and get some work. I think Ed and Paul talked about this, and it's very true. If you charge too little, you get the kind of clients where I guarantee you will have the most amount of grief, the most amount of revisions, the most amount of people changing their mind entirely about the mix when you've finished it. That's what happens. And you shouldn't devalue what you do. If I spend, let's say, a day on a mix, I should get it to the point where I'm ready for some feedback. And I would expect some comments, some revisions. But if I'm spending more than 2 days on a mix in total, there's probably something not right with something somewhere else. So 2 days, what should I charge for 2 days? What does it cost to be here? Well, I'm lucky. I own the building. I don't have to pay rental rates or anything else here, but it is on my property. So I'm paying there. So you could argue that's part of it. But I do have to earn a living. I've got mortgage, I've got bills, I pay for advertising. There's a whole bunch of stuff you've got to cover. You have to pay for insurance. You can't have all this stuff without having some hefty insurance. So there are costs. You have to make sure it makes sense. You have to make sure you can do enough work every week in order to cover your bills, cover whatever business costs you've got, and then have some left over to actually live on and enjoy. Otherwise, why are you doing it? I'm not saying you should be doing this purely for the money, but if it's making you a loss, you should be doing something else. If you're not good enough to earn a living, or you're not lucky enough to earn a living, it's not always about how good you are. You got to give yourself a time limit. How long before I think about doing something else because this isn't working? It's really, really tricky. My only advice to people that are struggling with it is that it is these days very often a lot about exposure. The more you can do social media, I know we don't want to do social media necessarily, we didn't get into it for that, but showing people what you do, talking about your work, a show like this or a popular Instagram or a TikTok or anything that can drive people to come and see what you do and maybe think, oh, I'd like to work with them. That is kind of how it works these days. 30 years ago, you'd have an agent trying to find you work based on what you've done, based on your CV. It doesn't really matter anymore. Very few people ever ask me about what's on my CV anymore. I mean, it's easy to find, but that rarely has anything to do with anything. They literally just find me because of social media these days more often than not. Anyway, get yourself out there, be good at what you do and be flexible. I would always say, it's very, very difficult. You might get clients who are pretty picky about what they want and they might not be a good fit. Sometimes people will struggle with a mix for weeks on end, can't get it to work. Eventually they'll hire a mix engineer, send you their stems, and you know pretty damn quick why they couldn't mix it. There is major problems with the source material. None of it fits together. The samples that they've got or the recordings they've got just aren't good enough. They don't gel together well. No amount of carving and EQ and effects and everything else is going to fix it. So you're kind of in a lose-lose situation. You have to go back and be honest and say, do you know what, production-wise, this isn't at a place where it's ready yet. That's a difficult conversation to have, but it's better to do that than to spend days mixing something and just never getting there. So stick to your guns, know what you're good at, know when to say no, even if you're desperate for the income. If you see a project and you think, it's got trouble written all over it, then bypass it. Recommend it to someone else who maybe could do a better job. That's about all I can say on all of that. It's a complicated situation. There is room for people in this industry. There's room for new people in this industry. I truly believe that. There is work out there. There are people looking for engineers. It's just finding the right people for what you're good at and being honest with yourself. What are you good at? Do you want to specialize in a genre? You don't have to, but it might help you if you do. Anyway, that's all. Just the musings and the rantings of a tired old sound engineer. Anyway, not really tired, I feel all right actually. Let's wind it up about there. If you could like the video, that really helps. If you could subscribe to the channel, that really helps. There's the Instagram, which is Mixdown Mastering. You can see all the stuff I'm talking about, my work, what I do, how I talk about it on my Instagram. This whole bit at the end, it's a bit of a sales pitch, isn't it? That's what you have to do. Get yourself out there. There's the Studio Live top 5 plugins, and there's a bunch of courses on mixing and mastering. And I will see you next time. Adios, people.